I know why you want to study the book of Revelation. Maybe not literally, of course, but I'm going to make an educated guess about why you're here. If I'm correct in my guess, it means this is the perfect Bible study series for you. If I'm wrong, then I just saved you a heap of time because you can skip this whole series. So here's my guess, see if it resonates. My guess is that you've read through the book of Revelation before. You've tried to picture all of the scenes it describes, and you may have even heard some teaching on it, but you've never really understood what it all means. But you keep coming back to the idea of studying this book for one of three main reasons. Number one, you can't shake the feeling that there must be more to it than a bunch of fantastical scenes and creepy characters. Number two, you want to understand what it means. You feel like there's a message in it that's made for you, but that message has always been just beyond your grasp. Or three, you're genuinely curious about what the Bible has to say about the end times. You may have been thinking about studying Revelation for quite a while, but you didn't acknowledge it because the next step, going along to another church or to a Bible study session in person, was just a little bit too scary. After all, there seems to be a whole pile of different interpretations out there. Even the theologians don't agree on a heap of things. And some of the loudest voices you'll come across in this space are weirdos. I mean, they're probably lovely people, but when you get them started on this topic, they get a bit too excited and they say things that don't seem quite right, like we're in the middle of the tribulation right now, or that the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus has already started, or that the government is already covertly implementing the mark of the beast. And there's the worst fear of all, the one you don't want to talk about, but it's always there. What if the teaching you end up following because it sounds good is actually wrong? What if you share it with someone else and mislead them? You might have even done a Bible study in the past. You probably felt like you were finally going to get it, to finally understand what Revelation means. But then the study finished up, and while you had a better understanding than you did before you started, it was still all surface level stuff. And it left you with the feeling that even though you'd covered the whole book, there must somehow be more to it. You're left wondering why, if it's not possible to understand the thing, why did Jesus bother passing this message on to John in the first place? Does this all sound familiar? Does it describe you? If so, I have good news, because this is the perfect Bible study series for you. It was prepared specifically for people just like you, and if you follow along, if you watch these messages in order, you are going to finally understand the book of Revelation. If this doesn't describe you, then, like I said, this Bible study series probably isn't right for you, and you can go right now and watch another video that's better suited. I really hope you find what you're looking for. In this Bible study series, I'm going to show you everything you need to know to understand the book of Revelation for yourself. And we're not talking surface level understanding here, we're talking a deep understanding of a whole bunch of things. We'll talk about the blessing promised in verse 3 of chapter 1, because while you might know that there is a blessing that's promised, you probably don't know exactly what that blessing is, or exactly what you need to do in order to receive it. We'll also be covering all of the different symbols, and I'm not just going to tell you what each of them mean. I'm going to show you some prophetic scriptures from the Old Testament that provide so much extra detail, there's no doubt what the symbols in Revelation are describing. We're going to cover the basic timeline of the events of Revelation, and I'm going to explain the layout of the whole book and give you an overview of all the different events, and I'm also going to explain the 4 different approaches to interpreting it. There's a summary sheet that you can grab for free, and we'll be using that as a reference on the way through the studies. As we get started, I'm going to explain the context within which this book was written. We're going to talk about who it was written by, who it was written for, and why it was written in the first place. The context is super important because we live in a modern world, and that can lead us to make some assumptions that really aren't helpful. It also means that some of the language and figures of speech and expressions that people used 2,000 years ago can go over our heads. But don't worry, because I'm going to explain those concepts and those figures of speech to you. We're also going to talk about when the book of Revelation was written, because there are a few different theories out there, and I want you to understand why one of those theories is far more likely than the others. We'll also be taking a look at the meaning of a whole heap of words in Greek, which was the original language that the book of Revelation was written in. It doesn't matter which English translation you're reading, whether it's an older translation like the King James Version, or a newer translation like the New Living Translation. The point is, every one of them is a translation from the original language. When John wrote down what he saw, he wrote it in Greek, and we need to assume that he understood the language he was writing in. The words he chose were important, and they were chosen for a reason. And when we understand what those words mean, we get a much deeper understanding than would ever be possible from reading our English translation alone. We're going to cover the messages to the 7 churches, and I'm going to show you how these messages have a layered application. The warnings and corrections within those messages apply not only to the 7 churches of John's day, but to the 7 churches of the 7 major periods of church history, and to the churches of today that were founded in those different periods of church history, and to each of us individually as well. We'll also be covering all of those layers of application when we get up to chapters 2 and 3. Now, I know that there's some teaching out there that casts doubt on those layers of messaging, but I'm going to show you how the delivery order of the messages and the meanings of the literal place names that the messages were delivered to, as well as the characteristics of the churches highlighted in the messages, all match up perfectly with the 7 periods of church history. I seriously don't know how God managed to arrange all of that layering, but he did, and you're going to understand why. We'll also be covering all of the usual stuff that you'll find in most Revelation Bible studies: the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 vials or bowls, as well as all of the different beasts, creatures, characters, and concepts we encounter as we go through the book of Revelation chapter by chapter and verse by verse. Yes, we'll be covering the Antichrist, the horsemen of the apocalypse, and the various beasts. We're going to talk about the 2 major conflicts, and yes, there are 2 major conflicts. It's not just the Battle of Armageddon. And I'm also going to show you how Ezekiel chapters 37, 38, and 39 are actually not referring to the Battle of Armageddon, but to a different battle in the first part of the tribulation. We're going to cover the rapture of the church and the return of Christ, and I'm going to show you how we know that the return of Jesus for his ecclesia and his second coming are 2 distinctly different events, and what each of those events is going to look like. You'll be amazed at how straightforward and easy to understand they are when you group the scriptures together in the right way. Towards the end of this series, we're also going to take a look at how the end times events described in the book of Revelation match with the end times teaching of Judaism and also with the end times expectations of Islam, because they do, and the way things are going to unfold and fit together will blow your mind. The most important thing is that in every case, I'm going to show you exactly where these details come from. I'm not going to say, hey, this is what it means, you need to take my word for it. I'm going to show you exactly where the understanding of every idea and concept and link comes from. And at the end, you're going to not just know a bunch of stuff, you're going to actually understand the book of Revelation, the events it describes, and what it means for you in your everyday life. So that's what we're going to be covering. And I hope you're getting the sense that this isn't going to be like any other Bible study you've ever been a part of. But before we finish up, I want to explain to you exactly what this Bible study series is not. You probably already know that there are a heap of books and Bible studies that have been written about the book of Revelation. And while all of them are well-meaning, to be honest, many of them don't give you a very clear picture. Or at least they aren't very good at explaining why they reach the conclusions that they make. So let me be very clear about what this Bible study series will not get you, so you don't confuse my message with any of those other ones. One thing you won't get from these Bible studies is an allegorical or an idealist interpretation of the book of Revelation. That's an approach that regards the book of Revelation as a series of spiritual lessons that can be applied to a whole bunch of different events throughout history, and not as a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. I believe that the book of Revelation was intended to be interpreted literally, which means that the revelation given to John was an actual picture of actual events that are literally going to happen in the future. We'll be going into detail about that in the next study, but there are 2 main reasons why I believe this is the right approach to take. The first is that history teaches us to expect prophecies to be fulfilled literally. And the second reason is that God has already demonstrated a freakish accuracy in telling the future before it happens. So we'd be foolish to assume that this book of prophecy was somehow inaccurate in any way. Another thing you won't find in these studies is teaching from a historicist or a preterist perspective. Now these are big words, but they describe literal approaches to interpretation that teach significant events of Revelation have already happened. The preterists believe the tribulation happened in 70 AD when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. And the historicists believe that the events of Revelation represent a bunch of different events that have already happened throughout history. I'll be showing you things from a futurist perspective, which basically means that I believe John was being shown actual events that were going to happen in the actual future, but that the period of time known as the tribulation hasn't started yet and won't start till we reach the end of the church age. I'm going to explain why I believe that to be the case in another video. But for now, all you need to know is that if you're looking for a preterist or a historicist resource, this definitely isn't it. If you're someone who already holds a strong view about what Revelation means, then you're welcome to watch along, because the added context might either help you understand the why behind what you already believe, or it'll help you adjust your understanding to something that matches the Bible more closely. I also want to make it clear that in this Bible study series, you won't be taught by a man. By now that should be pretty obvious, but if you are someone who believes that women shouldn't teach from the Bible, then these studies are definitely not for you. I know you probably didn't expect any of that anyway. I was just making sure that we set our expectations properly right at the start. So why should you listen to me? Well, the most obvious answer is because I have a really good grasp on understanding the book of Revelation, and it's not a grasp that's based on any one sort of teaching. My name is Amber Ward. I pastor an online faith community known as DiscipleHQ, and I'm the one who has put together this Bible study series. I've also got a master's in theological studies, but that really shouldn't be the thing that impresses you. What is relevant is my talent for explaining complex things in a way that people find easy to understand. Professionally, I've used this talent in the mining industry, in contaminated land assessment and remediation, and in website design and online marketing. It was really only when I was first called to pastor about 6 years ago that I began to apply the gifts that I've had my whole life to understanding and explaining the Bible. You see, I've got an internal drive to go digging into the details that most people either find tedious or they don't even notice. And once I've tracked down the details, I'm really good at connecting them together. If I notice a gap somewhere or something that seems like an inconsistency, I chase it down. When it comes to understanding the book of Revelation, that's a really important skill to have, because while the book itself contains a whole heap of information, as soon as I took what I'd learned about the Old Testament prophecies and concepts and used them to add to my understanding, the whole thing just came to life. And that's really what these Bible studies are about. While we're going to be going through the book of Revelation chapter by chapter and verse by verse, this isn't going to be like any of the other Bible studies you've been a part of. I'm going to be showing you a heap of details and a heap of connections that literally blew my mind when I noticed them. In ministry, I've done a lot of work with young people, so I tend to use words that anyone can understand. And when I do use big words, I explain what they mean so that everyone can be on the same page and understand what we're talking about. I'm not saying all this to brag, just to make a simple point. You're in good hands. If what I've been saying resonates with you, then this is the right study series for you, and it's time for us to get started. All you need to do is one thing, and that is to subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, click the subscribe button and make sure you also click the bell and turn on all notifications. If you're planning to listen in podcast form, then you'll want to make sure you're following this show on whatever podcast platform is your favourite. You can also connect in with me on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and TikTok if that's where you would normally hang out. Make sure you sort the subscribing or the following thing out right now, because you'll want to get a notification when I release the next Bible study in the series, and you won't want to miss any of them. Until next time, blue skies.